Wurundjeri country. And salam alaikum to you all. And salam alaikum to you, Mohammad. It is so nice to be gathered here during the month of Ramadan. As Rabia said, Ramadan is a month of connection for so many. It means so many things to so many different people who observe. I know in my parents' household there is a not unhealthy amount of hang-up from certain members of the family, but in all seriousness there is also a very peaceful and meditative spirit for that month, as opposed to all of the others that are unmitigated chaos. Mohammad, what does Ramadan mean to you, practically speaking, in your day-to-day and internally as well?
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me. I should start by saying I've got a bit of a hoarse throat because it's sort of 12 hours into the fast, so just forgive that. I mean, I'd say that Ramadan, it's various levels, I would say, to be honest. I mean, on the practical level, I think it's a journey. It's like a marathon, to be honest. There are the first 3 days where I would typically find it pretty difficult to get through the fast because I'm just not used to it from the last few months. And then there'll be the next few days where I'm sort of getting into my rhythm, and I'm probably beginning to feel a bit more that sort of sense of connection with myself that you've referred to and Ahmed referred to as well. And then through the middle of the month, I'm really perhaps into that rhythm a little bit more. And then towards the end, I mean, given the fact that I know that it's going to be coming to an end, I guess like any normal human being, I'll start looking forward to Eid until the end of it. But honestly, I'd say at another level, I'd say that it is an opportunity to sort of perhaps ground myself again, if you like, because I think there are all the qualities of Ramadan that Ahmed spoke about when he gave us the introduction. And I think for me, it's a bit like a lighthouse, I would say. And it's a bit like quite a few rituals that we all have in our various faiths or activities, which is something that you can look at and reference yourself back from. And for me, Ramadan is a bit of an opportunity to reset, if you like. Just think a bit more about what am I really doing, how am I really doing it, am I really being of service to the people that I love around me, like my family, my wife, my children, etc. Have I really got my priorities right? So I think it's really that opportunity.
I find it so interesting that often what people think of first and foremost, particularly from the outside, is the sort of the fasting elements, the elements that you see people do, the things associated, and the associated questions are always around how can you not eat, how can you not drink for that period of time. But whenever I do talk to someone who is observing Ramadan, it's always the internal elements that come out very strongly as well, and it is just a little bit different for everyone, and which is really nice to hear, as you've said. Mohammad, we're here to talk about your book, Border Crossings, and everything that's brought it to life. Before we get sort of into it, why don't you tell us a little bit about the sort of road that got you to this point, and how you sort of got into work that saw you travelling all over the world.
Sure. But before I do that, could I just make one little comment about Ramadan again? So
yeah,
just reminded me when you were saying. So this is Baku, Azerbaijan, about 20 years ago. So I was just over 20 years ago. So I was working in Baku. It was soon after the fall of the USSR, and Azerbaijan was in complete turmoil. It was in a sort of civil war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, this region. And I was working there. A lot of our project took place in the middle of winter, so it was like -15 centigrade. There was no food available. Electricity was in shortage. And I landed up there aged about 26, I think, and to work on economic reforms, to work on breaking down a centrally planned communist economy and introducing market reforms. And it was Ramadan. And so I sort of flew out to Baku, sort of thinking, and I'm not quite particular about trying to keep my fasts. So I flew out to Baku sort of thinking, okay, how am I going to deal with this Ramadan thing? So I took these 2 Pyrex little plastic flask things along in my suitcase. So when I went for dinner on the first night in Baku, I said to the waiter, and I used to speak quite a bit of Russian, so I did Russian at school for a few years. So I was trying to explain to the waiter in Russian that I'm fasting the next day. And I said, give me my dinner, and I said, give me another dinner in here. Because I sort of thought, I'll take that dinner back to my room, and I'll sort of eat that at 4 a.m. or something like that. And I just couldn't get him to understand what I meant. And then in the end he goes, I'm sort of saying Ramadan, Raza, Rosa. So Rosa is what they call it in Bengali, which is like a Persian word, right? And then the minute I said that, it linked to him, because he's Azeri, which is close to Farsi in the language. So he says, Raza. I said, yes, Raza, Raza. He goes, okay, I don't need to give you any food. You come back here at 4 o'clock. So I went back to my room, and it's freezing cold. It's like the places are, it's deathly quiet at night. And so I wake up at 4 o'clock, and I sort of trudge up to the next floor of the Hotel Azerbaijan, and it's all completely dark. All the corridors are completely dark, and I'm sort of thinking, this is such a bad idea. I'm just going to starve for the whole day. So I'm knocking on the glass, and then suddenly the light comes on, and this guy who's the waiter, he's sort of rubbing his eyes, and he's coming to the door, and he's just wearing a string vest, and he opens the door, and he sits me down, and he cooks me an omelette. And my heart was broken, because this is a guy that had basically stayed the entire night in the restaurant just because somebody wanted to fast. And so, and Azerbaijan in the USSR, religion, the practice of religion, had been more or less banned. So Azeris had not fasted for many decades, right? And so while he's feeding me, I'm sort of saying to him, "Are you going to fast as well?" He goes, "No." He said, "I'm going to do something." I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to give up smoking for Ramadan." I said, "Brilliant, excellent." I just wanted to share that with you because to me, it was a very touching. Just a very touching thing that happened to me in the midst of all the hardship I was facing, thinking about myself a bit, in Baku, to have this feeling of kindness and to have this feeling of connection with this person through that link was just something quite
That's it, and it's a beautiful example of how that feeling of connection doesn't have to, can still carry along with you, even when you're away from home and you're travelling, through the practice of the religion itself.
So you were asking about
so moving on, to your book, finally. So just a little bit about basically how you got to these positions where you find yourself in Baku as a 26-year-old and sort of what led you into that, which will then spring into religion.
It's a good question, and I probably don't have the best answer, but I think there must be a reason why I was seeking out this type of work, if you like. So I started my career with PwC as a grad in London, as in the economics practice. And the minute these opportunities came up, I would just put my hand up and say, yeah, I want to work on that. So I would go to a number of very, very unusual destinations, if you like, for the average sort of person working in a consultancy firm. And I was just constantly curious. And I think it was, this is me thinking about it in retrospect, not at the time, but I think it was something to do with just growing up feeling a bit of an outsider, if you like, right? So in the sense that, so my background is I was born in London. My family originates from Bangladesh. And so I basically sort of grew up feeling a bit of an outsider in the UK because I was like a different colour to a lot of the people around me at school, etc. And bear in mind, this is 30, 35 years ago when I was going to school, or 40 years ago actually. And then I would also feel like an outsider in Bangladesh because in Bangladesh I would go there and my family, we would go there every year for summer holidays. And the relatives would all say, "Oh yeah, you're the English one. Yeah, so don't give him the fish because he won't be able to pick the bones. Just give him the chicken." And there's people like me who have, we know how to eat fish, and we know how to wear a lungi, and we know how to do all of these things. But we would just be treated as though we're foreign. Now, it wasn't necessarily something nasty. It was just probably a caring attitude, to be honest, that was behind it. But it still made me feel as though I was a bit of an outsider. So I think maybe that's possibly what drove this curiosity to keep venturing and finding, identity, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a very common experience, the element of never being able to feel sort of quite right within both I remember once I was visiting my auntie in Belgium and I was in a phase of not eating carbohydrates. And this was very poorly received by my horrified Iraqi auntie who got on the phone to my parents and screamed down the line that I wanted zucchini noodles in place of rice. And it was just perceived as she's totally lost all sense of her origins. She wants zoodles. So,
because there are ways, aren't there, in which there's an expectation of what to do that means that you fit within the culture. So I completely resonate. That resonates with me a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, now I'm a little bit older, a little bit more confident with my own sense of being. I can go to Bangladesh, and I don't really care about what I go to eat or what I do, because I don't need to prove to anyone that I'm Bengali in some aspect of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
But there would be that time when I wasn't that stable as a person, all the way through to my 30s, I guess, where, it wasn't that easy, and I just feel like an outsider.
Absolutely right. That's exactly it. And is there something that drove you to write this book? The book was first published in 2021. Is there something about it that drove you to write it in this moment?
Yeah, so I started writing the book in 2005. And so what had happened there was I'd been previously married. I'd gotten divorced in about 2001, and I decided to start something new. So I decided to start learning Arabic. So I didn't speak Arabic, so I spoke a few other languages, but didn't speak Arabic. Although we knew how to read the Quran, and we knew how to pray, recite prayers in the Arabic language, but I didn't know what any of it meant, unless I read an English translation. So I thought, okay, let's learn Arabic. So I learned Arabic, and actually went pretty crazy with my Arabic, and I sort of became fairly fluent within about 2 years, including making lots of trips to Damascus back when it was pre-war, and learning colloquial Arabic in Damascus from a teacher during my holidays. And so I became really quite fluent in Arabic. Don't test me, please, but I but then what happened is that I then started traveling around the Middle East quite a lot during my holidays and doing some travel writing. Just started doing travel writing. Now I sent my travel writing to this journalist. Some of you might have heard of Robert Fisk, who was the chief Middle East correspondent of The Independent in London. He used to be based in Beirut. He died about 2 years ago. He died just before the book was published. It was such a shame. So I actually sent my writing to Robert Fisk, sort of thing I do, and he wrote back to me with a load of feedback. And then he met me a couple of times, and he said to me that you write well. You're not Mark Twain, because Mark Twain lived and wrote in Damascus, right? So he said, you're not Mark Twain, but you do write well. But you're something that Mark Twain isn't, and I'm not, which is because of the colour of your skin, because you're culturally quite able to connect with people, and because you speak a few languages, you gain people's trust quickly. But when you write about those people, you have the eye of a Westerner. So we trust your writing, right? So you're not trying to sell us a story. You're not trying to make something look good. You're able to talk to us like Westerners with an eye that we trust. He said that's quite unique. So he said, you do something about that. So that's really what inspired me to turn this into a book, to be honest with you. I had no intention to write a book before that, but that's what inspired me to turn it into a book.
That's very interesting. We'll come back to where, what that space looks like for a lot of people, where you're sort of in between cultures, and we've touched on it a few times. But you've spoken about the sort of experiences you've had travelling around extensively, and I think this would be a good moment to perhaps hear a little bit directly from your book about a particular experience that you had in Heathrow Airport, which comes right at the start of the book, and then we can sort of talk about what that was like for you.
Sure. Heathrow Airport, London. Good morning, sir. Could you step aside, please? I would like to ask you a few questions. Sure, I replied, rubbing the tiredness out of my eyes, putting up no resistance to the familiar drill. My questioner is evidently a government official undertaking extra surveillance following yesterday's terrorist alerts. I found out about the elevator security at London's airports on BBC News before boarding the crowded British Airways flight 14 hours ago. Where are you arriving from today, sir? Dhaka, Bangladesh, I add, thinking that the sun must be setting there about now. And what were you doing in Bangladesh, sir? He says with a monotonous groan, leafing through my passport at the same time. I was there on holiday, visiting relatives. I look over the thin-framed, whiskey-haired officer as he begins to examine my documents. His drab suit matches the grey, speckled carpet of Terminal 4's arrivals hall. Passengers silently weave through orderly queues, some speaking in muffled voices, and others looking subdued from jet lag. A total contrast to the cacophony of loudspeaker announcements and disorganisation of Dhaka Airport, where Heathrow's carpets snuffle out noise, the gritty wheels of roller bags and lopsided trolleys click-clack across Dhaka Airport's cracked-up tiles. Back in the first world silence of the UK, I'm missing the homely untidiness of Bangladesh, the vibrant colours, the humid smells, and incessant raising of voices. From his tired attire, I cannot determine whether the officer is from the Metropolitan Police or British intelligence. He has a kind, bedraggled-looking and spotty face. The thinning hair on his head is longer at the sides than on top. The blemishes on the maroon cover of my British passport include a crease that runs all the way down it, like a white water spring descending a craggy alpine mountain. The officer turns the pages with care, separating the leaves with meticulously shaped fingernails. His professionalism and duty to care momentarily cushion me from the cold reality of my travel experiences today, littered as they are with an incessant amount of scrutiny and suspicion over who I am and why I am travelling. He too asks me about my reasons for travelling so much, about my family origins, and in particular, about my frequent visits to the Middle East. I work for an international consulting firm, and I'm involved in a number of assignments around the world, so I have to fly around frequently. Plus, I travel a lot personally too, especially to the Middle East and Asia. What about the trips to Syria, sir, and to Lebanon, and Jordan? Were these for business also? As he poses the question, I catch him noticing the gold British Airways frequent flyer identification tag dangling from the strap of my knapsack. He cannot tell that I went to the West Bank last year, since at the conclusion of a 9-hour ordeal at the border crossing, I'd requested the Israeli authorities not to put a stamp in my passport, but to do so on a blank sheet of paper instead. Whilst his questioning is thorough, it is nowhere near as forensic as the Israelis, whose methods are purposeful and meticulous, full of mind games. I don't mention the West Bank trip. Mostly those were holiday trips. One trip to Jordan was for business. I wince at the memory of that awful meeting in Amman some months ago, when the executive we were negotiating with walked out of a heated session. Do you have any particular reason for spending so much time in the Middle East? I'm learning Arabic, and I like going to the region to practice. And I go to Saudi Arabia from time to time to perform the Muslim pilgrimage at Mecca. I feel a desire to get this questioning over with, to get out of Heathrow and make my way into London. Where were your parents born? The officer asks. My parents, I repeat back, looking at the officer but mumbling the words under my breath. Since childhood, I've been forced to deal with such inquiries, a necessary evil these days for many Muslims who travel a lot, their privilege of anonymity in travel temporarily withdrawn. As time has gone on, I've developed my techniques to a point where I can confidently challenge when needed. You don't really need to know where my parents were born, do you? I reply, nodding my head gently in the direction of my passport, the Queen's coat of arms showing proudly on its cover. I'm employing the same tactic I used successfully when stopped in Milan's Linate airport a few weeks ago. But that was with a smiling and casual Italian immigration officer who looked like he just wanted to practice his English. Today, I fear I've made an error of judgment by challenging this man barely a few weeks after the 7/7 terrorist attacks in London. The officer looks back at me speechless, and as the seconds tick by, I wonder what will happen now.
Thank you, Mohammad. That sounds like perhaps it would be the kind of thing that would happen. I hesitate to use the word randomly. But throughout the book, we see these kinds of obstacles thrown up at you often. And I know many Muslims, and I'm sure most of you do as well, who have certainly had trouble at various borders, particularly in the wake of 9/11. Further along in the book, we hear more about that 9-hour ordeal at the Israeli border, and it was harrowing to read. Does being a Muslim ever feel like a burden in the context of these sort of obstacles that you face?
Yeah, good question. I love the question. So, yes and no, I would say. So, yes, it can feel a bit like a burden at times, for sure. Certainly in that period of time, I'd say, sort of up to about 5 or 6 years ago, I'd say there was this continuation of me, at least, getting stopped in many places. It doesn't happen as much now, I would say. There was a feeling of burden, if you like. And I guess the other feeling of burden might be coming from the questions, about, so you fast, and how do you get through the day without drinking, and all that sort of thing. But to be honest with you, I think it's wrong of me to think of the latter type as a burden. I think it's actually more of an opportunity, because there's a curiosity that's often driving those questions. And some of those questions could be quite sensitive questions, like, for example, why don't you drink alcohol, or are Muslim men allowed to take 4 wives, or all sorts of questions that can be quite tricky to discuss, or can feel a little bit difficult. And you can end up feeling, or I can end up feeling, as though I'm being asked these questions because I'm being seen as a sort of representative, if you like, of this. But to be honest, I think at the end of the day, I think they're just opportunities to try and connect and to try and demystify differences in perception and so on. So yes, I do think it's a burden sometimes, but I probably shouldn't think it's a burden that often if you see what I mean.
It's an interesting point. I mean, in the moments where it does feel like a burden, and sometimes it's just, it's obvious that's the reason you're being singled out. It's hard to feel many other things in that moment. What role does the faith itself have to play for you?
I think patience and perseverance. I have been stopped, I don't know how many times, but at least 50 times in airports. And I've been held in rooms at least 10 times. I don't usually lose my temper or get irritated at those times. I think partly because there's a rational side of me that sort of kicks in and sort of says, okay, maybe this is random, but maybe it's not random. But in either case, there might be some justification to it. And so I'm taking a practical view and sort of thinking, look, I just need to work through this. There have been 1 or 2 occasions where I've had to do a little bit more than that to get out of the situation, because it started getting pretty hairy. But I wouldn't say, I think the faith side of it would just be perseverance and tolerance, I would say, rather than trying to complain that it's unfair. I don't usually do that on these particular occasions, to be honest.
So it sort of sounds like something that anchors you more in that moment.
Yeah, I think anchoring is a good way to put it. Yeah, that makes sense.
I just want to draw back on something you said about sometimes being made to feel like a representative for the faith. Do you think that, I wonder if we're going to get you to read another excerpt, but I wonder if you read it first and then we'll talk about it, or...
Sure.
Because I'm interested in, there's a bit of context to this one. It's a particular moment where, there's a couple of things being challenged, and I think it really shows some sort of interesting, it challenges this idea that all Muslims are one homogenous block, which I think is something that can often be slipped into, particularly where questions often arise about the practice of the faith or ideas in the wake of 9/11 in particular.
Okay, so this is a chapter set in Sylhet, which is, for those of you who might know, so it's a town in the northeastern corner of Bangladesh, which is where my sort of family originates from. This is a trip to Sylhet when I'm aged about 15. I harboured doubts about salam. So salam, I should explain. So you would have heard Ahmed saying salam alaikum. You would have heard Yusur saying salam alaikum, Rabia as well. So salam literally means peace. But in the context of Bengali culture, salam actually means something else. It means to touch someone's feet when you meet them by way of respect. So I harboured doubts about salam. As soon as I learned from Maulvi Sahib, that's my Islamic teacher, that in Islam, any form of submission to another human being was forbidden, the only question that remained around rebellion was when, not if. Only Allah should be revered in such a way, Maulvi Sahib would smile to us in the living room of our house in Grove Park Road. It is not right for us to lower our heads in front of anyone else. Maulvi Sahib was right. But I also understood that touching feet did not mean one was literally treating the other as a deity. Islam is so much about the intention and the principle, yet Muslim practice is so much about the practical and the literal. Finding compatibility between these two is an age-old test of life, whether it be for shortening prayers, performing salam, or all sorts of other activities. There are many ways in which we lower our heads to others in forms of deference not condoned by Islam. The main difficulty I had with salam was the expectation that one had to do it, fueled by symbolism, which in my opinion had gone too far. I disliked the hypocrisy of the action more than the action itself. For example, people from the higher classes would never salam those from the lower classes, even when younger in age. Salam had everything to do with status and little to do with true love or respect. It had nothing at all to do with religion. To further, you must salam anyone senior to you in age, even if by a single day. So why don't we all touch Abdul Latif's feet then? He is older than everyone, I would ask, referring to the barefooted and elderly security guard at our house in Dhaka. Neither Amma nor Abba, that's my father or mother, paid attention to my dilemmas over salam. In general, any inclination to probe into the logic of such actions caused irritation and was not appreciated. Amma was unwilling to entertain any discussion that performing salam should be abandoned and dismissed my attitude towards salam as the frustrations of an argumentative teenager. One evening in Sylhet, without much forethought or predetermination, I cracked. It was a dinner party at the house of the eldest daughter of the Modubazar branch of the family. A busy locality, some 3 kilometers further into town than Hazaripur, Modubazar was where Dadu's sister lived. Many prominent members of the family were present. On entry into the lobby, dripping with a few large raindrops caught from another monsoon downpour outside, I began by saying, Assalamu alaikum to each relative. I went around to the Murabbi, that's the elders, one by one, offering my hand to each of the men. The moment was significant to all for being so visible, and my abstinence from standard introductory custom was soon registered. As I continued around more and more relatives, the fact that I was in mutiny became evident, and for Amma and Abba, there approached the acute heat of imminent embarrassment.
What really strikes me about that passage is that it really highlights what we have spoken about at a few points, which is this, feeling of always maybe being in the middle or slipping in between or sort of having to bridge perhaps two different worlds, which is a very common, particularly migrant experience. At the same time, it sort of feels caught between, it challenges this idea that there is such thing as a homogeneous block within any particular identity that many people might have, and that in fact, of course, there are different views, there are different opinions, things are being challenged internally. So I found that really interesting. What was sort of your take on that?
Yeah, I think, let me just go back to the point about the different worlds, if you like. Because for me, the example about salam is probably one where I'm like trying to join all my different identities together, because there's the one side where I'm trying to be like a faithful Muslim. I'm also trying to be a respectful Bengali. But I've also got this sort of logic and rationality that's been, I've been trained with through school. Because of growing up and doing school in London, we're allowed to ask questions and we're encouraged to ask questions. We're encouraged to explore and argue with people in a respectful way. So I was really trying to bring all of that together, if you like, and that's why my logical side was saying, hold on, I shouldn't be doing this. It's got nothing to do with respect. And I guess that's what ended up, causing that mutiny, if you like. But in the end, it was okay because that was a mutiny. It was very embarrassing. It was terrible for my parents. But because the symbolism of what I did that day was difficult for people to accept. But now, 30 years on, nobody does it. Because everybody's now accepted that we don't need to be doing this. And people now say to me, well, you were one of the people who started this thing, a few years ago. So I think there was this desire on my side. What I should really say is that, what I really want to say is that growing up, I think there was always this pressure of, are you over here, are you going to be a good Muslim Bengali boy and behave like this and do like this, or are you over here, which is, are you going to be someone who sort of, mixes mainly with white people and friends and so on, and isn't necessarily in that camp. And these are always painted as being quite different camps. And I just wasn't ready for that. Because I felt like, okay, I'm sure I'm a part of this, but I'm definitely a part of this as well. So that's really why I think I was struggling a lot with all of these clashes. And that was me just probably trying to stitch it together, rather than saying, okay, I need to decide whether I'm this or this, which to me was an unfair choice to have to make.
Do you feel like that choice is still expected of you?
No, because I don't think it worries me anymore. So it might still be expected of me, but that expectation isn't something that I pay much attention to, if you see what I mean. Because I think I've now landed with being relatively comfortable with being all of these things. Because I think we sort of grow up, probably this is like a post-colonial thing, probably a post-nation state thing, which is we all grow up with a firm identity. We are British, or we're Australian, or we're Japanese, or whatever it might be from a national perspective. We grow up with fixed sort of forms of identity, if you like. And I think I'm now a bit more comfortable with, well, actually I'm all of these things. I mean, yeah, I'm happy to be British. I'm happy to, I'm sorry to say, support England in the Ashes. I'm happy to be Australian. I'm fully committed to Australia. I live here. This is my home. My wife's from here. My kids are schooling here. I'm happy to be Bengali, and I'm actually happy to be all of those things. So I don't necessarily have to sort of define myself to say, oh, I'm actually that. So.
There's a really nice term phrase that you use in your book that I hadn't seen before, which was, it was early on when you talk about an aspiration to become a culturally settled person. And at first I didn't really understand what that jumped out at me, and I didn't get it, but I think you've just now described exactly what that means, which was the happy landing place that you got to. In the few minutes that we have left, I would like to ask you to just read one more passage from the book about studying your masters in Cambridge.
Oh, sure. Finishing off my masters at Cambridge, I joined as a research associate in the policy and economics practice of a global consulting firm in their London offices, located by the Old Bailey Courthouse. It was a dream job. The firm was one of the few employers that emphasised the global nature of its projects and activities, and counted agencies such as the World Bank amongst its clients. My first boss, herself a PPE graduate from St Anne's College, 2 generations before me, instilled in us an irritable intolerance of mediocrity and a scepticism of the obvious. I knew we had someone joining us from St Anne's, but I didn't expect a fella, was what her first comment was to me upon joining, referring to how St Anne's had only recently become a mixed intake Oxford College. From forecasting the impact of a new terminal at a major UK airport, it's Terminal 5, to figuring out how Dubai might become a global hub when its oil ran out, to how to privatise Pakistan's energy sector, I was exposed to strategic topics that required analysis, as well as an ability to envision different outcomes across varied cultures. As a young graduate, the permission to even think about these kinds of subjects felt like a privilege. Whilst we were a talented group of professionals, I saw myself as being different and having something unique to offer. Most of my colleagues were from privileged white backgrounds and had seldom experienced social exclusion, whereas I constantly had to deal with cross-cultural, racial, and religious obstacles to get ahead in life. I was also familiar with my father's garments business, which by now employed 400 people and had export deals to America and the EU, and a supply chain in India and Korea, as well as with the Curry Queen and our other restaurants, where I had hired and fired staff, redesigned menus, and run local marketing campaigns. We'll just carry on for a bit. In early 1990s corporate London, bonus-rich bankers and consultants often frequented wine bars after work. Practicing Muslims like myself, who didn't drink, it's the fast train. Practicing Muslims like myself, who didn't drink or party, didn't have much choice but to assimilate or be left out. Champagne Charlie's, inconspicuously nestled under the arches at Charing Cross Station, was a favoured firm hangout. Sipping on orange juice, I would spend time in casual discussion with colleagues who were fascinated by my background, quizzing me as to why Muslims fasted from dawn to dusk and prayed 5 times a day, and whether Muslim men were really allowed to keep 4 wives. Having had a few years at university where I was praying only 1 or 2 times a day out of the stipulated 5, I was now back to being regular with prayers, so at least I could speak of my own practice. More innocently put than the same questions I was to field post 9/11, I saw these conversations as opportunities to break down barriers, but also important for building trusted relationships with seniors upon whom I had to depend for a diet of quality projects.
There is an evident experience of being othered there, just by reason of being a minority within those particular environments. What was sort of broadly your experience of sort of diversity in the workplace, and what it meant to sort of understand yourself as the diversity that people were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I started my career just over 30 years ago, and I was lucky enough to work in a group which was largely, white Anglo-Saxon people, but very broad-minded and very welcoming and very tolerant. So it was easy from that respect. There were all sorts of challenges though in the broader workplace, for sure. I think initially it was more of a racial thing. I think it became more of a Muslim thing in stages. I think the biggest stage was 9/11 for sure. That was like an overnight shift. But I think there was a Muslim thing that was happening from slightly before 9/11 as well. So I think it's been through different phases. And interestingly, when I think about Australia, and I'm lucky enough to live here now. I've lived here now for about 5 years, and it's my home now. I feel as though Australia's going through its own phases of coming to terms with different types of diversity as well. So.
And you sort of said, Mohammad, in that passage, you talk about sort of realising that you had particular insight by reason of your experiences, your dad's business, that sort of thing. What did you sort of come to appreciate effectively about your position in the workplace, where maybe initially it was an experience of being othered?
Yeah, I think that, initially, and it goes back to your question earlier about whether something's a burden or not, right? So I think initially, there was that feeling that this is a bit of a burden, like I'm the wrong colour. So, I'm not going to the bar every night, I'm not going to the pub, I'm not doing some of the things that really is perhaps valuable for people in trying to establish themselves in a career. I'm the one who's not going to eat the meat at the table, I just look a bit odd for, all these different reasons. So there was a bit of it was a bit like carrying a handicap around of some sort. There was that feeling for sure. However, I would say, and I would say this perhaps to so many of us in the room who are all from so many diverse backgrounds, is that I've actually come to feel that being able to deal with diversity is probably a bit of a superpower, to be honest, because through going through these hardships perhaps at times to deal with being on the outside or being othered, as you were saying, probably means you develop some certain levels of empathy, communication capability, ability to understand and put yourself in other people's shoes in a way that maybe is a little bit, you get a little bit better at that because you're othered quite a lot. So I almost feel as though, having had that journey is probably, it's a bit of an advantage, to be honest. It's a bit of a trump card, to be honest, in some ways.
Yeah, it's very nice to hear you put it like that, and I'm sure we could continue to go through all of the anecdotes in the book, which were all very insightful.